Welcome, citizens, to Pathway Online. We're so glad you joined us today. As you can tell, we are still on the lookout for Chaos, that dastardly criminal. But before we go looking for her, I need to ask you a question. Would you stand up and let's worship?
He's the one who makes the sun shine. He's the one who puts the moon in the sky. He's the one who hung the stars one by one. He's the one who makes the birds sing. He's the one who makes your dreams so high. He's the one who makes me smile. Day by day, Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Spider-Man. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Superman. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Batman. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than anyone. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Yu-Gi-Oh! Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Bobby. Yeah, 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 yeah. Better than Action Man. Better than everyone. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend. Jesus, you're my superhero. You're my star, my best friend.
Wonder where this piece goes. Ha! Right there. Now, where's the last piece?
Not so fast, Captain Pow.
Chaos! You've taken the last piece of my puzzle! You fiend! Give it back!
Nope. What you gonna do about it?
What I'm gonna do about it is I'm gonna capture you and get my puzzle piece back and finish my puzzle, of course. So give it back!
Nope. Have to catch me first.
Ah! I'm sad.
Captain Pow, what's the matter?
Well, I was working my puzzle when Chaos came along and stole the last, most important piece of the puzzle.
I'm so sorry.
And I can't catch her. Maybe I'm not cut out for this superhero thing. I just can't seem to catch her, and I just don't know. Maybe this isn't my purpose after all. I don't know what is anymore.
Captain Pow, have I got a story for you. So who loves to work puzzles? I mean, they can be a lot of fun. What do you think? You know, sometimes when I see these puzzles and I start putting all the pieces together, it's kind of hard to get the whole picture. Have a lot in one spot and a lot in another, but then all these holes all around. Sometimes it can be hard to figure out how this can become this. You know, it kind of makes me think that a lot of times life can be a lot like a puzzle. Parts of it make sense, some of it we understand, but sometimes it's just hard to see how everything goes together in the big picture. And what I want us to think about is how God always sees the big picture. He made us. He made us have a relationship with Him, and He has a purpose for each and every one of us. Each and every single little puzzle piece has a purpose to help complete the puzzle. And that's kind of like life and the things that we go through. And it kind of makes me think about what we've been talking about in Esther. So if we go back to the beginning and we remember that Esther was a Jewish girl who was living in Persia. She had been raised by her cousin Mordecai. And Esther finds herself the queen. How does a little Jewish girl become the queen of Persia? Well, after that, we also read about how there was a man named Haman. Remember, Haman did not like Mordecai, Esther's cousin, because Haman was very important in the kingdom, and he was given this high title and high position, and everyone was supposed to bow down to him. Well, Mordecai refused. And if you remember what we talked about last week, Haman was so angry, he went to the king with his great idea, and they made it into law that on a certain day, a few months later, all of the Jews would be killed. Everyone, the men, the women, the children, every single person. And at the end of our time last week, we talked about how the whole city of Susa had fallen into confusion, like, what in the world is going on? Well, remember, they had taken a copy of that law out to every province in every language. And when the Jews heard about it, how do you think they felt? Well, as you can imagine, that they were pretty upset. In fact, I'm going to read to you right here what it says that Mordecai had done, because he learned of the plot. It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had happened, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing and weeping bitterly. He was so upset. He had torn his clothes and he put ashes on him. What was that all about?
Citizens, you may wonder what mourning is. Mourning is being sad and despairing over something. For example, you may have mourned over the fact that you couldn't eat your favorite muffins for breakfast this morning. For the Jews and for Mordecai, mourning was much more serious. To mourn in those days, you would rip your clothes, pour ashes on your head so that everyone around you knew that you were sad. Kind of strange, huh?
It wasn't just Mordecai who was mourning and doing these weird things like tearing his clothes and wearing these different clothes and putting ashes on his head. All of the Jews in Susa were doing the same thing. They were very upset. They just found out that an order had been given to kill them all. Well, Esther heard that her cousin Mordecai was at the king's gate and that he was so upset. So she sent one of her attendants to take him some clothes to put on and change into some different ones, and he refused them. And instead, he told the attendant what was going on. He said, you have got to tell Queen Esther what is happening. And more than that, she needs to go before the king and she needs to beg for her life and the life of all of her people. Well, the attendant took this message back to Esther. And Esther was like, oh, I don't know about that. I can't go before the king. I haven't been invited to go before him for 30 days. Well, what does that matter? Captain Pow, could you tell us why Esther couldn't go before the king?
Citizens, you may wonder why she couldn't come before the king. In those days and in that culture of Persia, the king was so special that no one could come to him unless called for. For Esther to come before the king could mean that she would be killed for disobeying the rules. Isn't that kind of interesting?
So Esther told Mordecai, she's like, I can't do that. If I go before the king, like, it could mean my very life. But Mordecai had a message that he sent back to Esther. And funny enough, this verse is what we're so familiar with. Typically, it's the verse we hear when we hear about the story of Esther. I'm going to read it to you. It says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come into your royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai says, Esther, maybe this is why you are the queen. A little Jewish girl, the queen of Persia? Who would have thought? God just might have a plan and a purpose for this. So Esther sent back a reply to Mordecai, say, go and gather all the Jews and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, a night or day, and my attendants and myself will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. She said, if I die, I die. And so Mordecai went and he carried out all these instructions to the people. Wow, that's a pretty big hole in the puzzle. What do you think? So you see, Captain Pow, God does have a purpose for you. He made you the way he wanted you to be, and he put you right where he wanted you. God is at work, and he's got something planned for you. You're right where he wants you to be.
Wow, that's really encouraging. You know what? I'm not going to give up, and I am going to capture chaos. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do it right now. Captain Pow, away!
Esther had a pretty big choice, a pretty big decision that she needed to make. You know, there's sometimes we come upon stuff in life, and it's kind of like a no-brainer. Like I'm going to make a sandwich, and there's crunchy peanut butter, and there's creamy peanut butter. Which one will I choose? Most people, when you walk up, you know right off the bat, do I want crunchy? Do I want creamy? Or do I want nothing because I've got a peanut allergy? It's a pretty easy choice. But then there are other times in life that choices aren't so easy to make. And this is where we find Esther right now. This is a pretty big decision. You know, I think it's really interesting the way that Esther handled that. Instead of just saying, yes, I'm going to go, you know, at first she was hesitant, but even then, when she knew she was going to go before the king, she first stopped and she said, okay, Mordecai, this is what I need you to do. Tell all the people to fast for me, and I will fast and my attendants too, and then I will go before the king. She stopped and she took some time to fast. What is fasting? Do you know what that is? Little definition I like to use for fasting is taking some time to remove all the distractions in your life so that you can focus on God. And when you hear about fasting in the Bible, it's typically that they are not eating or drinking, and instead they're spending the time they would normally eat to pray and seek God. Think of all the times in a day that you eat a meal or you have a snack or things like that. Instead of doing that, you would pray. And I really think that's what these people were doing. It's what Esther was doing. So she didn't just go out and make a fast decision. She stopped. And I think that's a really good thing for us to think about. So I have a question I want you and your family to talk about. When you're faced with these difficult decisions in your life, how do you handle it? Is there any way that you could handle it differently? Do you remember to stop and focus on God before you do that? Why don't you guys talk about that for just a minute? Hit the pause button and come back and see me when you're done. All right, so let's go back to our fun puzzle. What about purpose? You know, the Bible doesn't say Esther thought this, but I know if it had been me and I was Esther and I was a little Jewish girl who all of a sudden found myself the queen of Persia, I would be wondering, how in the world did I end up here? What am I doing in this place? Those are the kind of thoughts that go through my head. But I want us to remember, like we said earlier, we may not always understand, but God has a purpose and He has a plan for each of our lives. Now, I want you to make sure you know that just because I know God has a plan and a purpose for my life, it doesn't mean my life is always going to be easy and nothing's going to go wrong. It doesn't even mean that I always understand, especially right off the bat. But it does make me think of another Bible verse, and it's one of my very favorites, and it's meant a lot to me in my whole life. And you can find this one in Jeremiah, chapter 29:11. It says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Well, that's a really interesting thing about this verse. See, this verse, Jeremiah told the people when they had been taken into captivity. You heard me right. These people had just been taken into captivity, and God had just told them they would be in captivity for 70 years. That doesn't sound like a good plan to me right off the bat, right? But then God reminded them, I have a plan. There is a purpose, and this plan is going to come about for your good. And I just love to think about that. It reminds me that I may not always understand what's going on or know why God does what he does in my life, but if I'll just hang tight and keep seeking him, it all goes together like all the pieces of the puzzle. And sometimes one section comes together a little faster, a little easier, and other sections take a little bit longer to figure out. But God has a plan for each and every single piece. There's a purpose for every piece of my life. And God is at work, and he is using that. And that's what we see in Esther. And we haven't reached the end of Esther's story yet. We kind of are at a cliffhanger right here. But we know that God is at work. Even if his name hasn't been mentioned in those scriptures in the Bible, God is at work. He has a plan, and he has a purpose. So make sure you come back so that you can find out what God is doing in the story of Esther.